Well, welcome everybody. I think we need to get started. Welcome to this first faculty panel, which I think is basically about counter-apocalyptic, but we'll see. It's my pleasure and honor to be here as part of this celebration of Catherine Keller's life and work. She's obviously, from everything we've heard so far, if you weren't convinced of that before, a brilliant thinker, and very good to think with, as Paul Ricoeur once said about symbols. I mean, very generative, very fertile work that I've myself clearly benefited from. I can't say that I've agreed with everything that Catherine has said theologically, but she is an unusually decent person, so generous and kind to, well, everyone really, but especially her students. And, you know, just as in a private joke, she's a much better person than the typical people who like my work. So it's a real pleasure. Yeah, it's shocking, and the disparity is shocking. But anyway, so we have a wonderful panel this morning. 3 papers. We're going to go in order of the program, and starting with Marcia. Each panelist is going to introduce themselves before getting into it for a half hour or so, and then I will try to moderate the ensuing discussion. Okay, so.
Now this is a bit tricky. I'm technologically very not adept, so we're going to try to make this work. Let's see if I can make this work. Can you hear me? No? Right, okay. Hi. No, why is it moving? There. This is not going to be easy for me. Okay. So I'm Marcia Pally. I teach at New York University, and I also teach 1 semester a year in the theology faculty at Humboldt University in Berlin. And my work involves religion and culture and politics. And this talk is, as you can see, trying to conform to the theme of the conference about the book of Job and the question of apocalypse and what do we mean by apocalypse. So with that, I will plunge in. The book of Job is not, just give me a minute. Let me see what happens if I do this. Maybe not. Okay. The book of Job is not usually considered part of the apocalyptic literature, although Job's fate certainly has the feel of an apocalypse, or as a synecdoche for it: loss of children, all wherewithal for staying alive, loss of health, everything crashing down all at once. What was the name of that movie? Everything, Everywhere, Everyone, All at Once, something like that, right? But Job also has the feel of apocalyptic literature in the sense of apocalypse as unveiling, revelation. And so the question, what is revealed to Job throughout the text and at its end? Jewish understandings of the book from antiquity through the medieval period consist of 2 main landscapes: either that Job is righteous, as the text states, and that Job's sufferings are not in fact punishment, but they are a trial or a test that will grant Job further divine reward in the end. Or that Job is not righteous, but has in some way sinned, and the ills that befall him are God's just punishment. In short, classic retributive justice. This paper suggests a presentation and alternate reading that the relationship between God and Job is one of reciprocal covenant, This would account for, and let's see what happens if I do this. Nothing. Yeah. This would account for Job's expectation of a conversation with God. 2, for God's in fact responding with just such a conversation, indicating that God too understands his relationship with Job as a reciprocal commitment. And 3, for the lesson of the book, that God is responsible to all creation, which requires divine capacities beyond humanity's ken, while anthropocentrism is dethroned. Job and we come to understand the relational, covenantal nature of the cosmos, which is cared for by the divine source of all being, broadly understood. The method of Job is apocalyptic, but the telos is something of an antidote, an affirmation of a universe overseen by a relational, covenantal divine. So very quickly, No. Sorry, guys. Yeah. So very quickly, a sketch of major positions in the Jewish Jobian literature. Job 1:1 of the Masoretic text describes Job as blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. If this is correct, as proposed by the medieval Pshat exegetes, Rabbi Samuel ben Meir, Rashbam, and Jacob ben Meir, Rabbeinu Tam, both grandsons of the great French commentator Rashi, then if this is correct, the book troubles the notion of retributive justice, where God does not punish the righteous with the wicked, Genesis 18:23. Job is righteous, but he seems to be punished by God, who thus appears irrational, immoral, or weak, just as David Hume suspected. This left commentators with the task of explaining either why Job is in some way sinned contra the text, and thus God is right to allow his suffering, or Job's suffering is not divine punishment, but something else, for example, a test of faithfulness to God, which increases later reward, or to showcase the righteous to the world, or to guide humanity to righteous conduct, even under conditions of duress. Among those who hold to Job's righteousness, the 10th century Sa'id bin Yusuf al-Fayyumi, or Sa'adja Gaon, believed that the pious Job was being tested by God in order to demonstrate that God's love and reward is given not unconsideredly, but only for truly righteous behavior. Among those who hold to Job as deficient or sinful in some way, Rashi states that Job sinned in his heart, as the text clears Job of only sinning with his lips. For Maimonides, Job lacks sufficient intellectual development. That's the problem. And that intellectual development would have allowed for better life choices, which would enable him to avoid harm, and that would have shown him the value of the spiritual and noetic over the material, which would have lightened Job's experience of material suffering. Ibn Ezra, my all-time favorite, held that Job lacked sufficient understanding of astrology, which would have enabled him to anticipate and mitigate the harm come to him. As you can see, both positions, Job was righteous or Job wasn't really righteous, require a good deal of exegetal noodling. In the 20th century, Martin Buber took up the problem in his 1942, The Prophetic Faith, which employs Job to explore the suffering of innocence. 60 years later, Stephen Kepnes considered Buber's reading of Job in light of the Nazi Holocaust. 4 responses to suffering are proposed in the Buber-Kepnes landscape. 1, here we go. Curse God and die. Taken from Job's wife's outcry in 2, verse 9, she understands Job's suffering as the act of an irrational, malevolent divine. We might as well curse this miserable deity and jump ship by dying. 2, will God pervert the right? Will the Almighty pervert justice? Is classic retributive justice. God is just and punishes wrongdoers. Ergo, if punishment or suffering is present, one must have done wrong. Buber and Kepnes note that this does not always appear to occur this way in the world. 3, the rent in the heart of this world notes that Job protests not only his own misery, but unexplained suffering in the world over. Thus, to maintain belief in God in the face of this irrationality, the believer must embrace the contradiction. Hello? Yes? Hey, man. Okay. So, the rent in the heart of the world, Job protests global, irrational, unexplainable suffering. Thus, to maintain belief in God in the face of this irrationality, the believer must embrace a contradiction, quote, though God may slay me, yet I will trust him, close quote. Job maintained, then this is a maintenance in faith in God in spite of, that's Martin Buber's term, in spite of the irrationality of suffering, as Buber repeatedly puts it. This suggests that the proper response to an irrational God is an irrational humanity. And 4, distributive justice, which posits something of a clockmaker deity who has set up a cosmic system which is just because each gets his due, as Buber puts it, or in Kepnes's words, we get what we can handle. The righteous Job is tested by God through an amount of suffering, on this view, that Job can handle, somewhat as Abraham was tested in the binding of Isaac. This is a proper and just distribution of divine justice. Now, this view is problematic, first because the God of the book of Job is not a clockmaker deity, but an interventionist one who intervenes in the very first chapter of the book. And if he were non-interventionist, why would Job spend 27 chapters calling for a conversation with God, a God who doesn't communicate? And how would one explain God's sudden communication with Job? More importantly, on the distributive justice logic, there is ab initio a tub of suffering in the cosmos, which must be distributed somewhere to those most able to handle it. Those of strongest faith and righteousness are thus subject to the worst brutality. This answers Hume's question, is God good, with a thwacking no. God ended each day of creation with the judgment that the world is good, but if a world with so much distributed suffering is God's idea of good, do we really want to know what is God's idea of bad? The theodical problem, as Paul Ricoeur noted, is that innocent suffering feels like an enigma, his word, only with the presumption of an ethical theology, his term, that is, with the production of potent and beneficent divine. Indeed, if God is irrational, amoral, or malevolent, both flourishing and suffering are not only explained, they are unexplainable. I'd like to propose another reading of the book of Job, grounded in covenant. It does not resolve the theodical questions, as millennia of theodicies do not, but it may, because it is at least understandable to Job as reasonable, be of some utility in thinking about suffering. Covenant. Covenant. I'll begin with distinguishing between contract and covenant. The instrumental quid pro quo is a technology for contracts, which protects interests. Covenants protect relationship and the integrity of all parties. Covenant, Jean Lee writes, is the promise with one or more counterparty under common pursuit of shared values for long-term cooperation and well-being of the community, close quote. It is the shared values, long-termedness, common good concerns that are key. It's worth noting that while covenant creates community, neither covenant nor community subsume the person. In Len Goodman's words, the covenant itself rests on and then rests on the freedom of the covenanters. Nor is the individual sacrificable for the community's sake, which is one point of the binding of Isaac narrative. Each covenanter has a place of value, even or especially, where reciprocal covenants are formed between unequal parties, between the divine and the human, and among persons of different social status. These bonds mark a significant worldview shift. Through covenant, Christine Hayes writes, the pagan picture of an amoral universe of competing good and evil powers is replaced by the picture of a moral cosmos. The highest law is the will of the deity, who imposes not merely order, but a morality upon the universe. Close quote. Covenantal commitments among unequals are reflected, among other places, in the biblical obligations to aid the enemy, stranger, and needy. And here I have a very long footnote of all the places in the Bible that mandate aid to the enemy, stranger, and needy. That is, covenants are forged not by lord and lesser lord, a vassal, who represents his clan, as ancient suzerainty treaties were. Covenants bond each person to God and persons to each other in direct moral commitment. This removes morality from the aegis and whim of human monarchs and grounds it in the transcendent, whose values one cannot tweak to suit regnant political powers. Now that's fancy talk for no kings. The covenant between God and humanity is universal, as declared in the Noah narrative. Though the covenant is an idea of the Hebrew Bible, it understands this bond universally for all. Covenant among person also applies universally. The covenant with the patriarchs, thrice repeated, is, quote, for the blessing of all the nations, that's thrice in Genesis. Emmanuel Levinas calls this the paradox of universalist singularity. His term, quote, the primordial event in Hebraic spirituality, close quote, and again Levinas, to be with the nations is also to be for the nations, close quote. Indeed, while beginning dyadically, God Noah, God patriarchs, covenant extends to community. Persons give to God by giving to third parties, to the poor or other persons in need. In Hebrew, hekdesh, or made holy. In this triangulation, covenantal commitment to other persons helps constitute covenant with God, and covenant with God sustains persons in covenantal commitment to others. The extension from dyad to community is found foundationally in the Ten Commandments, the first few of which pertain to person and God, the rest to living among persons in community, a seamless move from person to God to person among other persons. Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Proverbs, among other writings, go so far as to denounce the hypocrisy of performing religious rituals while abandoning the afflicted, as if one could maintain a ritual bond with God, absent bond with the needy, one of the most oft-repeated of biblical and rabbinic ideas. In covenantal reciprocity, stipulative features may arise, but covenant is not stipulative in motive or telos, nor do stipulations turn covenants into contracts. While unfulfilled stipulations generally void contract, unfulfilled stipulations do not end covenant, as the prophetic books repeatedly note. In spite of humanity's covenant breaches, God restores wholeness. In covenant, Motive and telos are relational, and relationship is the priority. Covenant in the book of Job. Yeah. So Job's friends make the mistake of confusing covenant for contract in holding to their retributive justice argument. God punishes evil with suffering, Job suffers, ergo, Job is evil in some way. That is, Job has violated contract stipulations and is thus punished. But as David Burrell notes, the friends actually never talk to God, but only about God from their own ideas and about God's retributive arguments. I'll quote Burrell, "Everyone and everything is leveled by the friend's relation to the Almighty, yet Job alone dares to address him. He, Job, moves leagues ahead of them precisely by seeking a personal audience with God," close quote. Joseph Thom similarly notes, quote, "The three friends err, not listening to Job in his peculiar state, but imposed on him a preconceived idea of a retributive God," close quote. Job, by contrast, is working from the realm of covenant, of dialogic and donative relationship. Moshe Greenberg notes that the book's frequent allusions to trial imagery do not cast God as a retributive moral accountant, that's Greenberg's term. Rather, Job so much assumes covenantal reciprocity that he feels God is obligated in what Greenberg calls a, quote, covenant lawsuit in reverse, man accusing God instead of God accusing man, close quote. Job calls on God to account for God's behavior. The universality of this relationship is underscored by Job's non-Israelite status. Job, qua human, says, quote, "Indeed, I would speak to the Almighty. I insist on arguing with God," close quote. Human integrity in covenant between God and Job. This insistence by Job to talk to God is the voice of human integrity. Job, Greenberg writes, despite his ruined state, will stand up to God, convinced that God must recognize his integrity, close quote. Like dialogue, recognition of the other's integrity, not the other's obsequiousness, instrumentalizability, or dismissibility, is a feature of covenant. Greenberg continues, Job is left, quote, longing for renewed intimacy with God, close quote. Intimacy is not quid pro quo contract, but covenant. Job specifically invokes covenant and gives an example of the righteous behavior that follows from it in chapter 31:1. Reasoned good faith exchange in covenant between God and Job. Job's faith in reason and evidence in his address to God further underscores his belief that he is in a covenantal, not irrational or malevolent exchange. He is not subject to the whims of the irrational God of Job's wife, curse God and die, or rent theology, or to the nastiness of a God who distributes the most suffering to the righteous who can handle it. He sets out evidence of his righteousness and expects God to respond rationally, which God does. In the whirlwind speech, his careful explanation of the workings of the world in language and imagery graspable by the human mind and experience. And that's fancy for good Godding. Respect for human knowledge in the covenant between God and Job. Like dialogue, integrity, and reasoned exchange, recognition of the viewpoint of the other is a condition of covenant and reciprocal regard. Ed Greenstein describes it this way. The book presents a philosophical argument about how our knowledge is warranted or justified. Job's companions stubbornly cling to the claim that all worthwhile knowledge has been transmitted and learned from tradition. Job, on the other hand, bases his claims on personal observation. Job takes pride in his absolute commitment to speaking only truth. Seen this way, the book of Job promotes honesty in theological discourse and rejects blind reliance on tradition, close quote. As early as chapter 9, Job twice tells God what Job knows: I am blameless. And in chapter 10:7, Job reprises, you know that I am not guilty. Job also knows that his punishment is disproportionate to any wrong he may have inadvertently done, and that the righteousness frequently suffer while evil flourishes in this world. Job says, I say, God destroys the blameless and the guilty, close quote. With this knowledge, Job stands firm, quote, I persist in my righteousness and I will not yield. I shall be free of reproach as long as I live, close quote. God's covenantal response. At this point, God does respond to Job, confirming the covenantal relationship. God could certainly ignore Job, delete, right? But the event of God's answer indicates a deity who recognizes covenantal commitment. Job is granted, quote, the immediacy and directness of divine presence, Samuel Terrian writes, through which God explains not only Job's immediate situation, but the ways of the cosmos. Second, God's tone is also consistent with covenant. T.C. Ham notes that the interrogatory, mise, who is this, God asks when Job speaks, is not the belligerent provocation, who the heck are you? Rather, it, quote, brings the reader's attention properly to Job as the recipient of the divine response. Rather than being a harsh reproof, the very beginning words of God resolutely focus on the person of Job, close quote. God calls Job my servant 6 times and addresses him with the politeness form na, please, if you wouldn't mind. Terrian notes that, quote, it could not pass unnoticed by a discerning audience how gently God cautions Job, close quote. Third, covenant is evident in God's attention to Job's specific query, why am I suffering disproportionately? The text uses the term ana, answer or reply, in God's response to Job's cry, oh, that Shaddai, God, would answer or reply to my writ. The same verb root, ana, is employed for call and response exchanges, as if to underscore the reciprocity of the conversation. God then explains that there is much about the cosmos, including suffering, that cannot be grasped by any created creature. Interestingly, the reader, too, does not know why God allows Job to suffer. In the strategy of the book of Job, the reader experiences the same theodical frustration as Job does. Why do innocents suffer? And learns the same lesson of epistemological humility. We just can't grasp it all. Fourth, in his willingness to answer Job, God affirms both the covenantal relationship and the validity of Job's knowledge within human boundaries. It is through Job's perceptual capacities and experience, through argument and evidence, which Job himself can validate, that God explains the workings of the world. This is not a demand for blind obedience. Like a good parent or like a good parent or guide, William Brown writes, God describes each worldly creature with such evocative detail that Job is afforded a point of view that lies utterly beyond himself, a perspective that is God's, but also ones that animals might have, close quote. God gives Job a new panorama of the world that God can grasp from his own sense perception and experience, rather than commanding Job to blindly accept God's dicta. With this, Job prays for his friends because Job understands by dint of God addressing him that he is in covenantal dialogue through which prayer is possible. Anthropocentrism dethroned the Jobian argument. In Bill McKibben's words, the whirlwind lesson in epistemological humility makes it plain that, quote, we are not bigger than everything else. We are like everything else, meant to be exuberant and wild and limited, close quote. Even as we rely on our own observation and knowledge, we have access to some but not all knowledge. Most of us intuit this from our life experience. Indeed, Job intimates the idea of human limitation himself, which Greenberg summarizes this way, quote, man knows how to ferret precious ores out of the earth. He conquers the most daunting natural obstacles in order to obtain treasure, but he does not have a map to the sources of wisdom. God alone, whose control of the elements, even of the weather, exemplifies his wide-ranging power. God alone comprehends this. Humanity perceives and knows limitedly. God rhetorically asks Job how Job could manage all the minute-by-minute occurrences of the cosmos. As managing the cosmos is clearly beyond humanity's ken, Job understands from his own experience and experience of his limits that the cosmos and God's actions in their totality are beyond his grasp. Greenstein notes that God in the whirlwind speech never expresses care for creation or nature, nor is nature particularly kind. Exactly so. The cosmos is limitedly understandable by human standards. It appears to us chaotic or brutal. In his reading of Job, John Levison's note that suffering may not be punishment for Job's wrongdoing, but precisely humanity is not in a position to fully grasp the reasons for worldly suffering. Echoing Levinson, Greenstein writes that Job's God is capable of what seems to humanity to be good and evil, quote, for his own reasons. Indeed, humanity cannot properly assess all good and evil because God's own reasons are precisely what we cannot fully comprehend. In addition to dethroning humanity's epistemological hubris, the whirlwind speech takes aim at anthropocentrism more generally. The rain falls, God explains to Job, in places where there are no human beings and without regard for humanity's needs. In this explanation, McKibben writes, God is describing a world without people, a world that existed long before people and that seems to have its own independent meaning, close quote. Humanity's ostensible dominion over creation is replaced in Job by the feral grandeur of the animal kingdom. Greenberg echoes, quote, the God of Job celebrates each act and product of his creation for itself, an independent value, attesting to God's power and grace. Job, representing mankind, stands outside or on the side of this picture, displaced from its center to a periphery, close quote. One might say that this is the gift of the whirlwind speech. Anthropocentrism is put in its place, but world is in the care of a God that bothers to explain this to us. At the end of the speech, Job seemingly retreats, saying that he's too insignificant to continue conversation with God, an understandable impulse by someone grappling with anthropocentric deflation. Yet God persists in talking to Job, in relationship, and in helping Job understand the world in which he lives. Concluding thought. Nope, wait. There we go. Moshe Greenberg holds that the author of the book of Job rejects the covenant relation between God and man with its sanctions of distributed justice. Perhaps but it might be the contractual quid pro quo that Job's author rejects. Covenant, the dialogic commitment evinced in the book of Job, endures through anthropocentric deflation and our epistemological limits. At the end of the book, Job's relationship with God is at its strongest and most sophisticated. He is not in the despairing world of Job's wife, or in the world of the harsh retributive God, or of the misery dispensing distributive divine. He is not in an apocalyptic world of crushing disaster, but standing before the apocalypse of unveiling, revelation, he has been moved beyond self-absorption to cosmic complexity under divine covenant. This will not relieve fear and suffering, I expect little does, but it might go some way toward moving beyond Hume to the uncomfortable, unsatisfying, frustrating truth of a never fully graspable cosmos. But somehow God, ground of existence, made it possible for us to understand precisely that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. This is also tricky. Maybe I'm going to do this. Good morning. I am Erin Runyons. I teach at Pomona College in Southern California. And my work is on the Hebrew Bible, but more broadly, the place of the Hebrew Bible, often mediated through Christian interpretation as it comes into culture and politics. My paper today is not really on the Hebrew Bible at all. Ooh, that's loud. So my paper today explores how narratives of formerly enslaved people refigure apocalyptic tropes. These are visions of encounters with with angels, also hell, angels and the divine, as well as celestial journeys to heaven and hell. Formerly enslaved seers move through cosmic realms and approach the divine in ways that refute the dominant ideas about punishment and righteousness that had served slavery well. This work is part of a larger project that traces how discourses about hell, captivity, and prisons have overlapped and influenced each other from the antebellum period until now. And I just want to say that I recognize, as a white person who has not faced the ongoing traumas of slavery and incarceration, that my analysis does bear those limits. And I certainly welcome comment. I offer this paper, though, in the abolitionist spirit of listening to those most affected by systems of captivity. The narratives I am looking at today come from oral histories of formerly enslaved people. These were recorded by volunteers, academics, and New Deal workers in the late 19th century and early 20th century, long after emancipation, mostly during the Jim Crow era. Nonetheless, apocalyptic interpretation has had a long history in enslavement. That's backward. There we go. Oh, there we go. Yeah, down arrow, yep. So this was the apocalyptic interpretation was evident most famously in the Confessions of Nat Turner in 1831, where visions of the cosmos inspired Turner to rebellion. Post-emancipation narratives, they rebel in a different way. They overturn the connection between righteousness, surveillance, and punishment that were taught as a form of control on plantations. Slave catechisms used the recitation of biblical text to curtail theft, regulate sexuality, and prevent rebellion. And hell features quite prominently threats of hell, but also heaven, promises of heaven. Eternal certainty was in the service of slaveholder control. So I'm interested in how the apocalyptic visions of formerly enslaved people move far beyond biblical reasoning
and also narrowly controlled access to righteousness. They cosmically overturn power relations. So part of what I'm thinking about in the larger project is how righteousness is really part of a punitive economy. And often ideas about punishment are linked to righteousness, or people who think they're righteous. So righteous certainty is an element of apocalyptic thought that is questioned by Catherine Keller's notion of counter-apocalypse. Catherine Keller has famously argued that the fantasy of escape to the future reinforces earthly destruction. The pain of the present and the past cannot be erased in the utopic future, she argues. Instead, messy, uncertain, this-worldly counter-apocalyptic hope and struggle is needed. With respect to narratives after slavery, Emily Casey has convincingly shown how they apocalyptically interrupt the linear time of racial capitalism. In another context, Felipe Maya calls this kind of refigured time fugitive futurity. Influenced by Keller, Maya considers how racialized people can find possibilities in the present that open into new futures. Guided by these scholars, but thinking spatially, I consider fugitive arrivals into cosmic spaces as they appear in visions of the formerly enslaved. These fugitive arrivals spatially reconfigure the divine and social arrangements of power. Righteousness is mediated by community and is untethered from punishment and surveillance. So I'll start with narratives that depict arrivals in heaven, and these will help us to appreciate how visions of hell actually challenge the threat of eternal punishment. So the first narrative is by Ned Walker of Winnsboro, South Carolina, and it tells of an arrival in heaven that contests earthly criminalization and punishment. So Walker's narrative was collected by the Federal Writers Project between 1936 and 1938. He was 83 at the time of telling. Walker recounts the death and funeral of a man named Uncle Wash, who was a respected member of a community of former slaves. Uncle Wash was a blacksmith. He was once a powerful man, but he was imprisoned for 2 years for, quote, coveting a hog. This phrasing raises questions about Wash's guilt, since coveting may be a sin, but it is not a crime. Perhaps he was falsely accused, along with many others in the failures of Reconstruction. In prison, Uncle Wash contracted consumption. His body wasted away, and when he came home, he died. So Walker recounts the sermon at the funeral. The sermon was given by Uncle Pompey, who was also formerly enslaved. In it, he disputes any connection between criminalization and eternal judgment. Righteousness is claimed through Uncle Wash's life and through community faith and prayer. It is not dialectically connected to punishment as it is in many theologies of salvation. So I will just note that the Federal Writers Project narratives are recorded in heavy dialect, and the politics of that ethnographic practice they require more time than I have here, and I will not engage them. So I'm going to project the recorded narratives in order to kind of keep the integrity of the primary source, but then I'm going to paraphrase them as I speak. So this, as Walker tells the story of the funeral, Uncle Pompey preached about Paul and Silas, suggesting that going to jail is not an indicator of righteousness. He spoke of Wash's life of labor and bravery as a blacksmith, in which he wrestled horses and made the tools to help grow the materials that fed and clothed the hungry and the naked. Toward the end of the sermon, Pompey looks up through the pines and sees Wash climbing Jacob's ladder. Seeing him halfway up, he enjoins the congregation to pray and to sing and to help Wash ascend. They sing, they shout, and they pray, signaling that they support and care for him as he moves into the new realm. By the second verse of the hymn, Pompey sees the dying thief welcome Wash into paradise. He rejoices that Wash is safe. Salvation is figured as collective effort towards safety rather than divine rescue from punishment. And I think I would just say that again, that salvation is figured as effort towards safety, not as rescue from punishment. And just also as an aside, I'll note that there's a whole literature on shouting in the African American religious tradition. And so I would just refer you to Ashton Crowley's Black Pentecostal Breath. Among other things, Crowley calls shouting, quote, a labor practice in the service of producing otherwise possibilities for thought, which is what happens here. Reading with Vincent Wimbush, we can see that this sermon signifies on apocalyptic scripturalization. As you know, Wimbush theorizes scripturalization as a form of power making. It is an understanding of Scripture, scripturalization is an understanding of Scripture that is shaped by and reinforces dominant discourses and racial hierarchies. In White Men's Magic, Wimbush analyzes the signifying practices of Olaudah Equiano in his narrative account of being enslaved and gaining freedom. It's kind of like a little bit tricky, this thing. Wimbush shows that Equiano borrows and undermines white scripturalization, engaging the same text, quote, engaging the same text, but also asserting power for himself, making words do what he wants and needs them to do for him. Walker's narrative is signifying, and he similarly makes use of many well-traveled images of salvation, which is Jacob's ladder, pearly gates, washed white as snow, and so on, and yet these carry another message of resistance. Further, the chosen text about the divine release of Paul and Silas from prison aligns Uncle Wash with the apostles and their righteousness. And again, as an aside, I would point you to Jeremy Williams' reading of Acts 16 in his book on Acts and criminalization, which is an interesting intertext here. Wash is greeted by the crucified thief of Luke's gospel, indicating that stealing and righteousness are not mutually exclusive, as the slave catechisms would suggest. Pompey locates Uncle Wash's righteousness in his life work as a blacksmith, feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, as Jesus famously enjoins. So this righteousness was recognized, aided, and amplified by his community. Fugitive arrivals in the other world also unravel the power relations that allow for surveillance and judgment. More than once, a seer gains access to the book of life. So this signifies on the book of Revelation, where the book of life is seen from a distance. Seeing what is written in the book of life is a variation on the theme of assured salvation that appears in many narratives of the formerly enslaved. As Albert Roboteau has argued, assured salvation, quote, contradicted the very force of the system bent on denigrating humanity. So we can take, for instance, the narrative of Ophelia Jemison, who was born free but whose mother had been enslaved. Ophelia recounts a journey to heaven, again to a New Deal worker with the Federal Writers Project. And again, this is in heavy dialect. She sees God and the Holy Ghost as one figure sitting at a table. This description is similar to the Son of Man described in Daniel 7 and Revelation 1, with eyes shining like the sun and a head of lamb's wool, which is notably not white person hair. The book of life is on the table. With confidence, Ophelia walks in and looks over the shoulder of the Son of Man, surveilling their judgment. Where in the slave catechisms there is a sense that God is always watching. There's lots of citations of Psalm 139. Here, even, and that is the idea is that God is watching when the slaveholder isn't. Here, Ophelia is the one looking. Spatially, she scrambles human divine hierarchies as well as racialized social relations. Typically, power holds records in secret, but here there's a kind of collaboration by a potentially Afroed son of man and the daughter of a former slave. There's a sense of communal access to records, which signifies on the tightly locked records of slaveholders or law enforcement in the Jim Crow era. Notably, there is no reference to punishment in this narrative, only the roll call of heaven. As Ophelia travels, she sees the stars hanging by a silver cord and the moon turn blood red, as in Revelation 6. She sees Christ in a rocking chair and Gabriel and Michael holding the laws. Her vision is panoramic. She gains new perspective. She transcends her usual access to knowledge. Note that she is moving while Christ stays seated. Even as she desires to be in this space, her movement questions the fixity of the cosmic order and the laws it is said to uphold. A similar narrative is given in the volume God Struck Me Dead, which contains the narratives collected by academics at Fisk University in the 1920s and 30s. An unnamed narrator describes seeing God sitting in an armchair staring into space. God is unconcerned with the narrator, who sees their name written in the Lamb's Book of Life. This description here calls to mind a slaveholder gone senile, fixed in place, while the seer navigates the heavens. Again, this narrative signifies on the usual order of surveillance. The hierarchy of divine over human, white over black, is disrupted. Here also, eternal punishment is not mentioned. So to summarize thus far, these cosmic visions propose heavenly arrivals as a journey into assured salvation that overturns scripturalized racial relations. And so it is in this sense that they are fugitive arrivals. So might these be examples of what Keller calls counter-apocalypse? And these are a couple of the places where this idea is developed, but of course there are others. As Keller says, counter-apocalypse is, quote, an unveiling that does not close us in either to pessimism or to optimism. Rather, it might disclose the causes of a world embracing hope. The signifying work of these narratives certainly unveils and challenges power dynamics. Their hope is grounded in community and requires community effort, as Keller also insists. But there are complications. First, unveiling may not be straightforward. As Wimbush points out, veiling can be a necessary survival mechanism for racialized people. Rather than unveiling, signifying offers half views and masquerade, which is a kind of seeing through the veil. Wimbush describes Equiano as needing to, quote, mask and unmask, indeed to identify and negotiate layers that mask and define the trauma of black flesh existence. In this same volume, Jacqueline Hidalgo considers apocalyptic thought produced by racialized people as one form of seeing through the veil. And she's drawing also on Chanel Smith, who is an alum of Drew, and Smith's idea of ambivalence. So Hidalgo says that the apocalyptic thought produced by some racialized people provokes a fracture of meaning regimes. The narratives that I've been discussing here are counter-apocalyptic in this sense of unveiling as a disruption of epistemologies. They fracture expectations about social relations and the place of righteousness and salvation within those relations. But these visions imagine arrival in a future world not characterized by continual striving. This could be considered the kind of escape about which Keller warns. It is here that Felipe Maya's idea of fugitive futurity is helpful, and he's developing this in relation to financialized futures, but he's drawing on Keller and in conversation with Keller on this point of the future, or future thinking. And he says, the persistence of future talk may be construed as a residue of the fugitive disposition that marked the resistance to slavery and anti-black racism. This reminder does not allow itself to be captured by optimism, but it remains steadfast in the pursuit of escape routes. Glossing Fred Moten, he says that fugitivity is flight from, quote, all that is properly housed. Fugitivity imagines futures beyond the imposed structures and enclosures of white supremacy. For my purposes, fugitive arrivals reconfigure apocalyptic spaces defined by white supremacist demands for righteousness that presume punishment as a default. Such arrivals perform textual and experiential disenclosure, to borrow a term from J. Cameron Carter. As we have seen, these visions are neither bound by strict adherence to biblical text, nor do they stick to expected spatial and social arrangements for Black people in the Jim Crow era. So now to think about hell. The signifying practices in the visions of fugitive arrivals help us to appreciate the revisioning of hell in conversion narratives. Visions of hell are certainly fear-inducing in these narratives, but they also defang hell's threats. Hell becomes something more like a test on a journey. In her study of conversion narratives, Yolanda Pierce says that hell, like slavery, is not merely a place from which to escape. Instead, these narratives conceive hell as a purifying process, a process that must be endured like a refiner's fire. And I agree that hell is not just something to escape in the narratives, but I would take this further to see them as affirmations of survival more than purifying process. Importantly, hell does not have to be faced alone. There is care and divine accompaniment on the journey before and after hell, and there is always arrival into a newly configured social space. The visions signify on the threat of punishment. For instance, a vision of hell inspires Elizabeth, a former slave, to convert and eventually take up a preaching ministry. As Nyasha Jr. points out, Elizabeth claims a kind of apostolic and prophetic authority. And so this is the journey through hell is part of the call narrative. Her account is given in an oral history taken in 1863 when Elizabeth was 97 years old, and republished in 1889. And this is by the Philadelphia Tract Association. It's pretty small to read. The narrative roughly follows the genre of conversion narratives. Rabateau describes the genre as, quote, a tripartite movement, first a feeling of sinfulness, then a vision of damnation, and finally an experience of acceptance by God. Yet, Elizabeth's account, like many other narratives, adds an element of divine assurance prior to visiting hell. In the visions she had, and this vision she had when she was age 13 while she was still enslaved, she first hears a voice that tells her to rise up and pray. She is then taught to pray. This strengthens her. Following this preparation, a figure appears to her, clothed in white raiment, and he guides her to see hell. So as she tells it, he leads her down a long journey to a fiery gulf, and then she's screaming for mercy, and she says, and she's wrestling, and then she says, "Still, I felt all the while that I was sustained by some invisible power. At this solemn moment, I thought I saw a hand from which hung, as it were, a silver hair, and a voice told me that all the hope I had of being saved was no more than a hair. Still, pray and it will be sufficient. I then renewed my struggle, crying for mercy and salvation until I found that every cry raised me higher and higher, and my head was quite above the fiery pillars. Then the Savior was standing with a hand outstretched to receive me." So having been taught to pray in advance, her cries for mercy raise her above the fiery pillars. So there's this communal element of teaching that enables her to survive. Like other conversion narratives, Elizabeth uses and signifies on an enduring image from Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which you know. Edwards famously imagines God holding the sinner on a slender thread over the pit of hell like a spider over a flame. For Elizabeth, though, the thread represents both precarity and promise. It represents being, quote, sustained by some invisible power. She is not presumed for destruction. Pierce cites another narrative in which the speaker is lovingly called by God, addressed as my little one, before seeing himself hanging on a thread over hell. Pierce says, Edward's angry God is only too eager to cast miserable humanity into the boiling mire. The God who answers the African-American narrator wants to protect his children. Many of the narratives in the volume God Struck Me Dead recount similar assurance before they journey through hell. Some modify Edward's image significantly. One unnamed narrator describes a little man who, quote, took me in his arms and journeyed on a narrow path that seemed no wider than a spider web. And so here Edward seems to join John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress. On this narrow path, they passed devils who threw large balls at them until they came to a beautiful pasture with a willow tree in which the narrator is dressed by a beautiful mother in clothes that fit perfectly. And there are overtones of Yamaya possibly there. Other narrators are guided by a voice or again by the little man on a narrow white path or simply on the narrow path. There is more than a hint of remembrance of the many fugitives that pick their ways through the dangers of terrain and patrols, and the communal practices of guidance. In more than one of these narratives, they arrive at a place of beauty and care where they are reclothed. Many, they see themselves in new bodies. They navigate through hell with community accomplishment until they reach safety. Like Keller's counter-apocalypse and Maya's future fugitivity, these narratives are highly aware of the pain of the present, in which punishment was a constant danger. The signifying practices of these narratives makes righteousness assured despite expectations and threats to the contrary. And this is a Kara Walker sculpture I recently saw that really visually demonstrates the argument that I'm making, which I won't go into right now, but you can see that it's a pedestal of a monument. It's in the monument show in the MoCA, and it's sort of overturned, and you have a silhouetted African-American figure who appears to be in the flames of hell. Importantly, righteous arrival is a result of communal systems of care, teaching, and accompaniment. These narratives use apocalyptic imagery to see through and unveil the regime of righteousness and punishment that characterized slavery and the Jim Crow era. The righteousness that these narratives envision is not constrained by surveillance and threat, nor does it mark a fixed and enclosed arrival. They offer us a counter-apocalyptic view of flourishing and salvation that are rooted in community care and do not require regimes of punishment. Thank you. There's actually, there we go. Do you have a PowerPoint? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. Any tips?
Yes, I do actually have a tip. If you hold it like kind of flat and then use your other finger to press it,
okay,
it kind of seems to work a little better.
Okay, and it's down. Yeah. All right. It's a classic technological environmental problems. It's good to be with you all, and thank you for your papers in advance. I'm seeing resonance. My partner doesn't exactly know what to call TTC. I was saying to a couple folks last night, Transdisciplinary Theological Colloquium for someone who's not interested in theology is a particular mouthful, and so he keeps referring to it as talking to Catherine. And so I'm deeply grateful for that and to be here with it. It's also doubly spooky in the sense that I find myself at Trinity College Dublin now, and of course one of the contexts of Revelation theology is the rapture, of course, and John Nelson Darby, who was the Anglican promoter of the rapture theology that gets promulgated into the Schofield Reference Bible, and I spookily share a birthday with him, and I don't know what to do about that, but this paper comes out of a more joyous Trinity moment, which is conversations with my colleagues Jude Lal Fernando on militarism, Siobhan Garrigan on homelessness and displacement, and teaching with my peace studies colleague Gillian Wiley on the politics of forced displacement. So that's where we are. So 2 epigraphs to begin with. Line of sight. From Revelation 16:20, and every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. And secondly, from Kathy Jetnell Kitchener from the Marshall Islands. No one's drowning, baby. No one's moving. No one's losing their homeland. No one's becoming a climate change refugee, or should I say, no one else. In an infamous and confrontational speech to the United Nations in 2017, he who shall not be named opens with thanks for aid and support from other countries in the wake of ecological fallout. President Trump says, references the millions of our citizens who continue to suffer the effects of the devastating hurricanes that have struck our country. Following that brief recognition of disaster, the speech quickly turns to elevate an ideology of American sovereignty against current international policies exemplified, in his view, by uncontrolled migration. Quote, terrorists and extremists have gathered strength and spread up to every region of the planet. International criminal networks traffic drugs, weapons, people, forced dislocation, and mass migration threaten our borders. The logic of planetary boundaries is curious and paradoxical here. Trump's America is simultaneously affected by ecological disaster, rendered vulnerable, and yet a fidelity to violent sovereign borders is reaffirmed. Apocalyptic ecological rhetoric wraps itself deeply around the roots of the discourse of climate displacement. Conservatives in North America and Europe tend to prefer and invoke images of watery destruction, racialized figures of migrants, flood, and unleash waves of chaos by the boatload. The tide of migration threatens white supremacist figurations of culture. And these metaphors of catastrophe conjured fears of instability and the dread of the effects of increasing environmental disaster, even if they don't always recognize and sometimes go in the face of the recognition of climatological force behind the intensity of those disasters. Rarely do the metaphors or voices invoking these and this kind of rhetoric dig deeply into the manifold causality of forced displacement, violence, hunger, poverty, devastation of island, coastal, or indigenous communities, histories of colonialism, nor do they imagine a just response. Contemporary immigration rhetoric of all kinds invokes the genres or themes of apocalypticism. We heard some of it yesterday with the great student papers. Yi-Jan Lin writes in her recent book, Pairing the Two, Immigration and Apocalypse, How the Book of Revelation Shaped American Immigration, that the ancient sense of apocalyptic seems to have little to do with immigration, but when one considers Revelation's Book of Life as the procedure at the border, something that I'm constantly navigating myself as a sort of bi-located scholar now, crossing weekly nearly with the Irish and American border and the UK border. But when one considers Revelation's Book of Life as the procedure at the border, for instance, or the influence and presence of Revelation's imagery, language, and logic in both the American founding myth and the subsequent discourse surrounding immigration, the resonance expands. For Lin, particularly, quote, the New Jerusalem metaphor proves to be flexible, recyclable, and manipulatable myth for American discourses of immigration, citizenship, and exclusion. The great thing about not being a biblical scholar is I don't have to do the contested pericopes of that. I can just move along. In this, Lin's book briefly notes that the text of Revelation, quote, describes all of the horrible climate catastrophes and wars that its refugees escape, and wishes that all of the money going to border enforcement might go instead to responses to climate change. Quote, climate knows no borders, Lin concludes, and if nothing changes the investment priorities of US political power and money, America will eventually find itself in the lake of fire rather than the New Jerusalem. That fiery prophecy is ominous itself, yet Immigration and Apocalypse, the book, stops short of thinking about climate displacement in these contexts explicitly as a figuration or a cultural production shaped by theologies of apocalypse. And so here and there, thinking it's sort of a Seussian, apocalypse now and then, apocalypse now and when, apocalypse here and there, apocalypse everywhere. I want to consider more concretely the construction of the apocalyptic figure of the climate migrant, the environmental or climate refugee in contemporary political imagination. And so I want to proceed in three parts. Firstly, by interrogating the nebulous figure of the climate migrant and the securitized thematics of climate displacement. Secondly, by considering theology's emergent responses to, as responses to apocalypse of place, so the places where climate displacement is emerging in theology, and giving it emergent voice to that reality, and where it might still need to address some contemporary political theologies of securitization, international border imperialism, and racial capitalism. And then finally, I want to take a walk with Catherine Keller and her call to dream read the apocalypse, and consider the figure of the inhabitants of the earth in John's book of Revelation as complicit with the securitized figure of the climate refugee, and wonder if Revelation as disclosure might challenge the closure and the securitization of borders in that way. What would it look like to mind the labyrinth of the immanence of the divine in Revelation as a site of refuge and resistance? So, studies vary as to the specifics of the impact of climate-related displacement. The UN Refugee Agency report No Escape 2, the finality and the second part of it, highlights the complicated data. By mid-2025, the number of people displaced by war, violence, and persecution stood at over 117 million. Over the past decade, weather-related disasters have caused some 250 million internal displacements, equivalent to over 67,000 displacements per day. And these displacements often occur in fragile and conflict-afflicted settings. And the number of countries reporting both conflict and disaster displacement has tripled since 2009. By June 2025, over 86 million displaced people were living in countries with high to extreme exposure to climate-related hazards. What is clear is that the implication of populations and climate displacement, both in environmental calamity and the slow, fast creep of change, is growing rapidly. More of us are implicated and in these histories of displacement. Climate displacement in most popular reports names a number of interwoven factors then that cross international borders and move within them, internally and externally. One only has to think about the news over the last week of the stats about the collapse of the Atlantic Ocean current, for instance, and how the movement of that increasingly likely to collapse will potentially compound and have displacing effects in Europe and North America and elsewhere. From embodied realities such as the eventiveness of weather, hunger, heat, poverty, conflict, scarce resources, etc., to the embodied and subjective experiences of loss, such as the submergence of islands, nations, the loss of local cultures, national identity, landscape change, where one loses a felt sense of connection to place or history, the disintegration of indigenous traditional lifeways and practices, and their survival. Rarely, all those play into this. And rarely, more often of late, the non-human is taken into account, where biologists are tracking shifting migration patterns, displaced bioregions, species cascades, and adaptations brought about by forced movement or the inability to move. The inability to move is part of displacement as well. The statistics can gesture towards these experiences, but they never fully capture the radically diverse ways that people testify to their own experience. And here I think of Bill McKibben, to invoke Bill's name again, suggestion of Earth with the extra A as a sort of displaced word, a displacing spelling of our tough new planet, a tough displaced one. Addressing climate displacement is a fraught task. At the same time that Christian nationalist rhetoric rises, so too have efforts to account for just responses. So both the right-wing rhetoric and Christian nationalism, as well as social justice concerns to address climate migration and climate refugees increases. Recent UN COP gatherings have highlighted the growing concern, and as No Escape attests, quote, climate change is not only amplifying existing vulnerabilities, it is also fueling displacement trends, creating complex and compounding risks for refugees, other displaced people and their hosts, and leaving many with no escape from its impacts. Those compounding risks require a suite of responses that is often complicated and as complicated as climate change itself. Officially, however, and this is the rub, the category of climate refugee does not exist outside of either the right-wing political rhetoric stoking fear or the more aspirational rhetoric of the liberal fear of environmental calamity itself. As Todd Miller writes in his early book on the subject, Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security, despite predictions of a startling magnitude, there is no legal framework for climate refugees. Not in international law, not in the laws of specific countries. Instead, there's more spending on border reinforcement than ever before in the history of humankind. Miller traces the intensities of responses to climate displacement in public policy and invocations of the figure of the climate refugee, or climate refugees therein, to the military-industrial complex. Or, as he heard from the executive director of an energy company called Constellation, the, quote, military environmental industrial complex. Climate displacement is a hot commodity for military preparedness. Homeland Security experts speak of climate displacement as a threat multiplier. You've likely heard that term in a variety of contexts, and it's also used by the UN. That increases risks of terrorism and violence. Politicians across the spectrum have embraced this framing of displacement as a security issue. Securitization of borders becomes a commodity to address the growing risk to society, unraveling from the onslaught. And Miller reports that even in one moment, quote, British Rear Admiral Chris Perry summed up the international security consensus regarding climate refugees in perhaps the most vivid terms. The future climate migrations would be like the Goths and Vandals, the barbarian invaders who brought down the Roman Empire in the 5th century. Large immigrant populations, he said, would have little regard for their host countries and begin a sort of reverse colonization. Perry, in that, invokes another apocalypse, this one with the historical lament of Augustine and the contemporary lament of white Christian nationalism, of pure empires, and their degradation. Such responses attempt to maintain current and economic political power structures without transformation or addressing core challenges to prevailing notions of sovereignty or to the current class and extractive conditions that bring about movement and displacement. Miller quotes Betsy Hartman on this point, saying that degradation narratives has proved particularly popular in Western policy circles because it kills a number of birds with one stone, and probably actually kills birds as well. It blames poverty on population pressure and not, for example, on lack of land reform or off-farm employment opportunities. It blames peasants for land degradation, obscuring the role of commercial agriculture and extractive industries. And it targets migration as both an environmental and security threat. Here, the securitized interpretation of the climate refugee is elevated, borders are intensified, risks assessed, and the problems of climate change are associated with or attributed to or identified with victims. If there is climate adaptation here, it is, as Miller says, quote, climate adaptation for the rich and powerful. George Schmidt refers to this kind of adaptation as a kind of necropolitics, invoking the provocative image of the armed lifeboat. That's the sacking of Rome, armed lifeboat. Critical theorist Neil Ahuja takes Miller's observations about climate securitization narratives to the next level. And his very important book, Planetary Specters, Race, Migration, and Climate Change in the 21st Century, Ahuja tracks the invention of the climate migrant, quote. The figure of the climate migrant, Ahuja argues, quote, has emerged as a media icon not because of the nature of the weather of, or ecological destruction of, or the ways that it's fundamentally changed the nature of human mobility, but because it offers a rhetoric about migration that appeals to a set of racialized presumptions about human conflict and population dynamics that fit into increasingly apocalyptic and conservative northern political imaginaries of climate change's destructive social effects. The figure of the climate migrant then might fit into what Emily Towns has called a certain cultural production of evil. Migrants flood not because they're affected by floods in this context, they become another metaphor, the flood itself. This is not to devalue, importantly to say, the actual experiences and extremes of displacement genuinely experienced, but instead to intensify focus on the real contours on things like extractive colonialism and racialized capitalism. In Ahuja's analysis, the racial engendered spectacle of the climate migrant can mask the structural and historical forces that have produced systemic vulnerability for a variety of subaltern national, racial, and class groups, especially with the rise of the oil economy in the 20th century. He continues, using stories of personal tragedy linked to images of dark-skinned migrants, mainly women and children from the global south, struggling to maintain adequate shelter and food in settings of ecological crisis, climate migration discourse works to homogenize different solutions of social conflict into a narrative in which geological and atmospheric processes are positioned as the true roots of displacement, as opposed to, say, again, climate, colonialism, or extraction. As such, in migration studies, transdisciplinarily, the climate refugee, or the term climate refugee, is a figure complicated by desires for climate justice and questionable. And most literature in international relations or migration studies prefers the term climate migrant to get precisely away from this securitization narrative. Jamie Draper argues for a pluralistic approach in these contexts where climate displacement is considered as heterogeneous. It takes on many different forms in different contexts and is causally complex. Climate impacts are usually only one part of the constellation of interrelated causal drivers. With that pluralism, he argues, climate displacement must be contextual on one hand and justice-seeking and tending to the other aggregate forces behind the scenes as well. Who counts as a climate migrant when so many are affected? Who deserves protection under international law, and from or for what situations of extreme response? And here's the tension then, that one must on one hand give an account of the genuine and diverse world-ending experiences of displacement and migration as they relate to environmental devastation, and on the other they have to challenge the apocalyptic degradation narratives and the spectral figurations of the racialized, securitized narratives of the climate migrant that amplify military and border security. How can one seek legal protection, survivability, community, refuge, and reparations for loss? One has to challenge that figure, and here the intensifications of hunger, famine, plague, more violence matter. The importance of rehearsing this transdisciplinary foray into migration studies is to set the context for how theology engages climate displacement. Climate displacement is really only entering into theological studies in fits and starts. One of the most promising moves here is the displacing genre of co-writing modeled by Veronica Kyle and Laurel Kearns in their The Bitter and the Sweet of Nature, weaving a tapestry of migration stories, where one can think about the entanglements of displacement as figurations of power and testimony. These modes of disruptive storytelling as they emerge will do some of the best work decolonial disrupting the borders and academic practices themselves. And I'm sort of looking back to challenge a certain privileged narrative while also looking forward to these diverse stories. Others, like systematic theologians, Mary Emily Briel-Wells-Duba, Siobhan Garrigan, and pastoral theologians like Drusha, Matz, and Neal have argued for the importance of displacement for theology, frequently turning to the languages of place itself. Duba speaks of the high level of displacement, arguing that the incarnate God inhabits and makes space for inhabitation. Siobhan Garrigan argues in her recent, my beloved colleague Siobhan Garrigan argues in her recent Theology of Home in a Time of Homelessness, that we have to move away from ideas of participation as possession and instead think of the divine as home against those capitalistic notions, and instead modes of discipleship and home practices and mutual companionship and care give a larger account of potential making home in displacement and movement. She's thinking specifically of homelessness in the Irish context. Drawing on her engaged living and working with churches in Fiji, other direction. Drusha, Matz, and Neal's book, Holy Ground, Climate Change Preaching and the Apocalypse of Place, is one of the first major texts to take the lived experiences and folk theologies emerging out of climate-endangered places, island nations specifically, in a serious and sustained way. Places have indeed ended already, and others will, not on the horizon, both then and now. And she argues the witnesses of displaced and occupied communities are critical for Christianity shaped by Western colonialism. Neal engages and critiques theories of place, like Duba and Garrigan, to think about the ethics of and responsibility for eco-social place. She observes that many environmental voices advocated Western subjectivity's sort of find topophilia, return to nature, return to a love of place. But for Fijians who find their own sense of place disappearing underneath the actual waves lapping out from histories of colonialism, the appeal to rediscover a love for one's place does nothing but remind of the histories of violence and loss. As Neil writes, quote, "The community is actually struggling with displacement, occupation, and forced relocation. We're asking different questions. They did not need theology to tell them how to recover a lost sense of place. They had lost land, and not on account of their own carelessness, lack of attention, or greed. They had lost them because of geopolitical and economic forces outside of their control." Neil turns to these communities to think of an apocalyptic sense of wayfaring, navigating the seas of loss, and connecting to an exilic sense of place caught in the midst of already and not yet destroyed. And here she actually goes back and does rereadings of the prophet Ezekiel as rethinking the concepts of sovereignty, belonging, and loss, sovereignty, exile, and loss, that might attend to places bordered and relational complexity. Here, sovereignty is not power over, but instead responsibility for land and maintaining a sense of responsibility for land. The loss of land itself compromises sovereignty and asks for new and creative memories and responses. What is generating and striking for our language here is Neil's appeal to the language of apocalypse. There's real apocalypse, the destruction of island nations, and there's disclosing apocalypse, that these islands take on apocalyptic prophetic calling out of their losses to challenge the effects of colonialism, extractivism, and ideologies of infinite growth. So in the final few moments here of my paper, I want to turn to thinking with Neil's decolonial intuition that gets us closer to challenging the complex roots of climate displacement, capitalocene, plantationocene, militarycene. But if scholars like Miller, Ahuja, and others are right, that we need to lift up the complexities of displacement more, and that theologies working out of privilege must challenge head-on the commodification and securitization of the spectral image of the climate refugee and the apocalyptic theologies that coalesce around it. Extending from Neil's own insights about biblical imaginary, the apocalyptic is a genre, thematic, of intensifying displacements. Perhaps the reality is due to the impact of exile and the on apocalyptic and prophetic texts. Exile is core to it. Apocalyptic writers live in exile or are taken up, displaced into new perspectives on the earth, conceptual realities, the human, the animal, literary genre. As an undergrad, I used to sneak into Craig Kester's master's classes on the Book of Revelation, where every 5 minutes he'd have us singing a song, so the genre disruption of reading straight and the musicality of the book. Genre, gender, race, heaven, and earth are displaced, morphed, and hybridized into one another. That these displacing perspectives are written from physical displacement, sometimes called exile, matters. Take the book of John that sits on the precarious edge, eschaton of the library that we call the Bible. John writes from displacement on Patmos, an island now impacted by climate change, presumably in the midst of some kind of persecution. That, of course, is contested in varieties of ways. Yay, I'm not a biblical scholar. And displaces the reader through the 7 letters to other places. Literally reading, John sends and displaces the reader to other locales over and over again. Time itself loops with the intensifying violence and release spiraling and looping, giving the book a strange formal structure of displacement as well. In her early Apocalypse Now and Then, Keller named the displacing spatial realities of the texts already, and his Eschatology in Space, Brazilian Lutheran theologian Vitor Westphal demanded that we retend the dimension of space in eschatological thinking. As Catherine invites us to dream read the apocalypse for its ambiguities as a way of minding it, tending it, I wonder if we might spatially circumambulate and walk with these displaced figures in the apocalypse of John. Even though I would resist the co-option of the indigenous phrase, these are their resonance here for things like walkabout, more complications for rhetorics of cruising as well. Homi Bhabha, in his writing on displacement, calls contemporary migration and displacement the, quote, barbed wire labyrinth. And I wonder if we might instead borrow Bhabha's metaphor and reclaim Keller's dreamy strategy into the space of contemplative labyrinth, noting its borders and barbed wire danger. I could say more about the logics of racialized animality there, but I'll leave that for Stephen Moore. As Lynn points out, earth dwellers in Revelation are spatially driven and spatially displaced by ecosocial phenomena and climate catastrophe. The plural singularity of the character of the inhabitants of the earth, both plural and singular, gets the raw end of the eschatological deal. The earth dwellers stand in stark opposition to those who dwell in heaven while the drama is finished. The inhabitants stand as a diverse crowd, human and non-human, reduced to a singular, securitized caricature of violence outside the New Jerusalem. God appears like a border-obsessed brigadier general, worried about the contamination of the earthly, the flood of earth dwellers. They are unfaithful, dangerous, idolatrous, deserving of divine wrath, and other trials that will face them as in the maze as they are condemned to, and that's 3:10, deserving of vengeance, 6:10, even as they undergo the compounding effects of the four horsemen of conquering violence, famine, and plague. Why would we not want to keep them out of the heavenly city, John, he seems to ask. They navigate their own spiraling barbed wire labyrinth. These are the katakointes, the ones who inhabit, dwell down, kata, okeo. We can hear the intense oikos of the big earthy economy here. They are inhabitants of the earth, a name that might even honor like a local garden cooperative or any that seeks a broader habitat. They're the ones trying to stabilize while the ecology of divine violence rains down on them. In dream reading, walking the labyrinth with them, we might not be able to stay with the caricature of them. Instead, seeing the four horsemen that drive them compound their plural and heterogeneous experience. They are not just the earthly displaced climate refugees, they are those for whom structures awash them in the multiplicity of the earth. They're affected by those structures, and yes, sometimes complicit in them as well, but their stories are manifold. One listens to and tends to the convergences of violence and the convergences of the texture of lived complexity, even joy and pleasure, in those facing mobility and justice, and seek forms of redress that take up those lived structures into account. This piece is Rena Collett's Woven Chronicle. It's a mapping of migration movements with colored barbed wire. So labyrinth of barbed wire. In Facing Apocalypse, Catherine senses a divine displacement in Revelation as well, God coming down. Is this God self-displacing sovereignty or a movement of divine desire for renewal? Quote, only as divinity comes down into otherworldly immanence can this new creation happen. Divine displacement shifts perspectives, tending to intimacy that might open up, disclose a brief moment to resist the closure of divine border imperialism. The earth dwellers may also be whom with God dwells. God dwells where they dwell. One might also finally consider the oddly out-of-place tree in the heavenly city itself, and I'll end here with that image. The center of calm in the barbed wire labyrinth. In 2017, Mary Mattingly produced a living piece of art for the Storm King Art Center in New Windsor, New York, along the lines of displacement, transplanting a tropical tree outside its agricultural region as a way of bringing attention to displaced creatures, the ways those creatures thrive in resilience. In one sense, it could look like an invasive species, but in fact, it's meant to be a form of ecological displacement. Transplanting a tropical tree outside its agricultural region, and a climate justice scene for youth in Scotland now demands Paradise Now, thinking about trees and gardens, quoting Rachel Walker's 2022 call for gardens without gates. Gardens without borders, gardens for all folks. How are we meant to learn if we are locked out, she says? How are we meant to access knowledge and learning of food production and food growth sustainability if we're not allowed in? Can we not be trusted with the trowel and packet of seeds? Rather than thinking about John's arboreal experiment as a destination, what if we consider his displaced tree of life a reminder of refuge and resistance to teleology? Sort of, if it's not too a clunky, sort of a refugistance mode of refuge and resistance. A contemplative pointer that even in the midst of the city of the New Jerusalem, there is a fundamental displacement, a reminder of what is outside of the city. A contemplative pointer to the reminder of the inhabitants of the earth, a garden without gates, allowing the possibility of communal sustainability. Baba notes in a somewhat Derridian way that at the core of the idea of the citizen is the refugee. You can't have one without the other. Citizens of heaven and refugees of earth. it might displace our own sense of destination and demand prophetic discontent with what I began the paper with, demanding no one else. Thanks.
Well, thanks for those incredible papers. I mean, they're incredibly rich. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. I thought I'd just start us off by thinking about the papers together a little bit, and maybe then seeing whether the panelists would like to talk a little bit among themselves first. But, I mean, it seems pretty clear, at least to me, that the three papers are trying to develop a counter-apocalyptic, where apocalyptic is primarily being understood as a meaning-making template, a way of making sense. And I think one thing that a couple of the papers suggest is that rather than focus on the temporal dimension of apocalyptic, what it's saying about the future and our attitude towards the future, is to think more about the spatialization that's involved in apocalyptic and trying to come up with a counter-apocalyptic that would involve an alternative spatialization. So climate refugees, I mean, all the spatial accounts of displacement going on there and how they're read through an apocalyptic lens. I mean, you can do that differently. But also and obviously the three panelists are using very different materials to think about a counter-apocalyptic, the Book of Job, ex-slave narratives, what's happening on the climate migration front. But I think Aaron is also focusing on the spatialization that you find in, the spatialization of vision that you find in the ex-slave narratives, and I actually thought you might be able to do a little more with that. I mean, usually you're focusing on the content of the visions rather than like the fact of the visions, which are very, don't seem to be very future oriented, for example. They're about being taken up and lowered down and especially being taken up into heaven, and there are things going on in heaven, but all that is taking place in the present, and it's the presentness of those visions that seem to have the most power. I mean, they are visions, and they're very dreamy. I mean, they're very much like dream worlds. They're very concrete. They're very material. They're very visceral. So I thought you could do more with that. The other thing that I think especially the first two papers, one of the moves that's being made there is to counter the kind of retributive justice character of apocalyptic, the focus on that, that's what we're looking for, that's what's going to happen. And that, I mean, I didn't think the ex-slave narratives that I know, that those questions tend to drop out altogether. It's not just that the people who are considered to be criminals for stealing hogs or whatever are not going to be punished, but it isn't even a question. Whatever's happening there, even when you're being, when you're over, being lowered over hell by a thread, I mean, there is a fear based on punishment, but there's something else going on there, and certainly when you're taken up into heaven, it's not like the law being fulfilled or the just being rewarded, that seems to totally drop out of the picture. So I'm wondering whether, I think the first two papers are offering, to some extent, an alternative sense of righteousness, communal righteousness that isn't focused on retribution. But I guess I'm wondering whether the righteousness language can just drop out altogether. That's not what's at issue. The law is not at issue. The legal categories are tending to drop out. The way that, say, Ricoeur talks about biblical text, especially the Hebrew Bible. He's interested in the way in which the legal categories are just absent, or even if you're talking about covenant, you're not really you're talking about a relationship, you're talking about call and response, you're talking about questions and answers. But the legal dimension of it, the legal categories there, are not so evident, and that might be one way in which you have a kind of counter-apocalyptic, that the righteous legal punishment, that's not your relationship to other people and to God. But then, yeah, from our I know you've talked about covenant in many places. So this is possibly something you've just said somewhere else. But I guess I was wondering when you were giving your talk this time around is that, the categories of covenant that you're using, like reasoned response, speech, conversation, that it's not clear to me that that understanding of the covenant can be extended to non-human creatures or to, whether they're animate, inanimate, that can't call, can't, question, can't argue, can't converse. The Noahide covenant, what kind of covenant is that? That's not doesn't seem like it's the same sort of, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. Same sort of covenant that you have in Job. Anyway, so that can maybe start us off, but yeah, the papers were really great, very interesting. Do you want to talk among yourselves? No, I don't even know what that is.
That's
But if you want to say something, I think you have to take a mic. Yeah.
No. I'm not saying anything. I'm just, I'm doing mic distribution.
Excellent. Does anybody want to respond to anything I said, or just respond to one another? Because I think you are raising some similar themes. Marsha, don't you want to respond to mine?
There's sorry, Nicola. Well, there's an interesting thing about covenant as reasoned responses. One of the things that I find interesting about Job is that covenantal conversation happens. If it does happen, it happens via failure, right? Like the Bildad and Elihu and the friends aren't necessarily breaking covenant with Job or God. They're just failing in that conversation, or it becomes part of the ambiguous processing of the inability to answer, such that even like when God comes to speak about the animality, like Leviathan and those other sort of quasi-mythic creatures are almost failures of our understanding of the material and biological world, such that God, it just seems to me sometimes that God in that text actually sort of echoes the failures of the friends in some ways, like that even God's answer in a vocation of wonder is a failure in some respect that is also sort of mirrored in the friends. They are all different kinds of clowns in answer, but I don't know if it's the same thing as the Noachic covenant, right, which is a covenant with flesh. Is a covenant with all flesh engaged with reason response? Probably not in the same kind of way. So the very materiality of things becomes a covenantal reality rather than an agreement to.
Can I say one thing, though? A more pointed way of making my point was if you're trying to counter the style, if you want, of meaning-making that's associated with apocalyptic, one way of doing it is to offer a different kind of explanatory frame, a different interpretive frame, which I think covenant would be. But you could also just say, well, what Job is telling you is is a kind of counter-interpretive urge, that the demand for meaning is, that's often said, I think, about the whirlwind speech, but.
So just a few, hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Great. Just a few thoughts. So one is on the sort of the Noahide, or the covenant immediately after the flood. So the flood not only annihilates humanity, it floods the earth, meaning plant, vegetation, and anything else that was living on the earth is also toast, or the opposite of toast, right? It's just submerged, right? And so the covenant at the end is that God will not destroy the earth again, not just that God will not destroy humanity again. I think, so if you pay attention to that, it's a covenant with the earth as well as with humanity. And interestingly, there were theologians of the 17th century Reformed tradition that I think Vigert's was one of them, that explicitly said that the Genesis narrative is a covenant, is of the creation of the earth and a covenant with the earth. Now, the earth, so that's not an addendum, it's in the structure. So that's, I think if we keep that in mind, if we picture it, the whole earth is submerged, everything is destroyed. And the covenant is to never do that again, which would include plant life, animal life. I also think that the scientists of the Jobian era could not have known this in the way we do, but that they certainly knew something, because as we now learn that animals have emotions and bond and grieve loss, and let us know about it if we pay attention. We know that trees communicate with each other. That now this reality complicates, as it should, our ancient understanding of the vastness of covenant as relationship, as opposed to contract as legal stipulation of, you know, I pay you $100, you build me a bookcase, right? So, and I also want to point out, finally, the distinction between the whirlwind speech and the Elihu position, or the Elihu in Hebrew. Elihu comes in, and a lot at the end of the three friends who yatter on for many chapters, and Elihu comes in at the end and suggests, he starts to make the suggestion that Job cannot understand the complexity of God's vision. And the examples that he gives are all examples where God does things in nature for the benefit of humanity. Like it rains on the crops, and then the sun comes out and things grow, and so on. Elihu is very popular with the exegetes from the rabbinic era all the way through the modern era, with one thing being remarkably omitted. The whirlwind speech says the opposite. It doesn't say that God creates rain for the flourishing of human crops. It says God puts rain where there aren't any people and never were. And God, you know, worries about baby vultures. You know, they have to eat too. And ostrich eggs that get, why are they in the sand, right? I mean, and that God attends to all of the jots and tittles, not explicitly, not as Elihu said, for the sake of humanity, for which we must be very grateful, but precisely for the sake of the cosmos itself. And then that, I think, is the covenant that we can come to understand.
No, that's very helpful. I was just, maybe I was misreading or putting the wrong emphasis on, you know, what your interpretive frame was there. That when you're going through the various ways of interpreting Job in terms of suffering and retribution and blamelessness and blah, 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 that you then bring in the understanding of covenant in virtue of certain, you know, the call response, the question answer, the argumentative character, the reasoned response on the part of God, which gives a certain slant to what a covenant would involve that isn't very readily extendable to say things without reason. But yeah, no, what you're saying makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, let's open up. I have some thoughts about Job, but I'm not sure they totally follow on this track, so. Okay. Do you want to go first? Sure. Yes, go ahead.
We're having a little fight here about who should go first. Okay. Hello, I'm Stephen Moore. I teach biblical studies here, as though I didn't know any of you. Yeah, I have a quick question for Aaron, and then an observation about Marcia's and Jake's papers that may turn also into a question. But hold the mic closer. Okay. So, Aaron, I wonder if you could say a little more about the rocking chairs and the armchair. Now, that's not, I hope, as trivial sounding a question as it might sound, but I hadn't come across that before. But if I understand what was being said in what you quoted, I mean, the heavenly throne, you know, even like the great white throne of judgment is somehow being turned into, well, an armchair in one instance in which God is kind of dozing, and in the other it was more than one rocking chair, and Jesus was occupying one of them. So anyway, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that reimagining and what you see, how you might unpack that. So, yeah, you just go ahead with it.
No. Sorry.
Yeah, the other part was I would never have thought to read the book of Job in tandem, say, with the book of Revelation, and I know you didn't quite do that, Marcia, but the more I think about it, the more intrigued I am, because it's like they are at opposite ends of, you know, kind of the theodicy spectrum. On the one hand, you have a book that, you know, endlessly agonizes over, well, the suffering of the innocent, but it's just one person. Whereas the book of Revelation has always seemed to me really as like, you know, the book of collateral damage. I mean, to invoke that kind of awful, impersonal, altogether inadequate term. But, I mean, Catherine, you know, discoursed wonderfully last night about, you know, the third of this and the third of that and the third of the other, and how we're already there and beyond it. But as you so well know, you know, just read on, and a few chapters later, you know, the entire sea becomes like the blood of a corpse. So you know, it's a theodicy run amok. But also, it seemed to me that you also, Jake, at certain points in your paper, I mean, effectively we're wrestling with theodicy, and I thought particularly when you were dialoguing with that scholar from Fiji, and you know, the suffering of the innocent anyway. So those are just my thoughts.
So I will say about those images, the armchair and the rocking chair, I was sort of reading those as potentially in the position of slaveholders. In the Ophelia Jemison narrative, she sees God and the Holy Spirit together as one in a Son of Man figure, and they're sitting at this table with the Book of Life, and she comes and she looks over their shoulder, which I think is an amazing image. So I think it could be read in a couple of ways, and I was trying to do that. One as like signifying on the practice of surveillance, but also there might be something, you could also read that image as you could read the Son of Man figure with the lamb's wool hair in another way, as a potential community member. So I think there was maybe I was reading that image in sort of dually. Then in the Ophelia Jemison narrative, there's also Christ sitting in a rocking chair over the sun. So I think those, I don't know that I obviously cannot speak for the narrators, but they do seem, especially the God sitting in an armchair, like staring out and not really paying attention to anything, you know, does seem like power power that's lost its hold to me. So I think that's how I was thinking through those figures. Yeah, but I still do actually. I was searching through narratives to find armchair, rocking chair images to see if I could, do that exegetical work, and I haven't landed on anything that is, tells me this is that. But it does. There was another narrative I came across about somebody who was able to go into the home of a slaveholder and sit with the children in the rocking chair, but of course rocking chairs were ubiquitous as well, right? And so many of the narratives are actually given in rocking chairs. So I don't know if historically I could make a claim for it, but it just does seem to have those senses. And I just wanted to say one thing about righteousness. Yes, absolutely. Why do we need righteousness? Why do we need that? What I'm presenting is kind of in response to the kinds of logics that get taken up in slave catechisms, but also in the carceral system. Yeah.
And just to maybe say one thing is that I think that the theodicy is becoming more and more interesting as the conversation goes to me, because theodicies frequently function as border security for doctrinal imaginations, right? On a systematic theological level or on an apologetic level, it becomes a way in which one dictates insider-outsider moments. But when those enter into a sort of political theological space involving forms of sovereignty and getting included into national borders or to ethnic borders, then that becomes a different kind of piece. But what's, I think, good about and helpful about what Marsh is doing is that the sort of mutual recognition of a kind of openness or a kind of wonder there actually, maybe from God, somewhat potentially refuses that closure of the border in some way. There's a sense in which God sees Job, right? That address to Job, rather than saying, no, back off, right? That's a border.
I'll just add a few ideas, and they're in the messy order in which I jotted them down. One is that the mechanism of the narrative of the book of Job, of course, is one person. But as Job himself says early on in the book, this is about the suffering of humanity worldwide that seems inexplicable to us. So it's not just one guy, Chuck over here, right? It's a discussion of theodicy. And of course, that's what Buber picks up on. Martin Buber picks up on the problem of the suffering of innocence. And about righteousness, that's the retributive justice argument of the friends, of the three friends, Eliphaz, Elihu, Bildad, and they are wrong. I mean, they're in the book because they are wrong. And at the end of the book of Job, God tells them that they are wrong, and he doesn't want to hear from them. And Job, because Job has the covenantal relationship with God, Job prays for them precisely because they're wrong, and God thinks that they got it wrong. So that's, I think, part of the point, that sort of the emphasis is completely on the wrong syllable for the friends, right? They've just gotten it wrong. And I want to thank Catherine for bringing up this point about making the distinction between what comprises or constitutes a covenant between God and persons, which might be different from what constitutes a covenant between God and, I don't know, an amoeba or a frog or and so on. And that all of that falls under the covenant landscape with the precisely including all the non-humans, because the humans are decentered. in the whirlwind speech. And the Leviathan and the Behemoth are noted as God's first instead of humanity as God's first. You know, just to stick it to us, right? You think you're so fabulous. So I just wanted to throw out those points.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, thank you all. I have also sort of like an observation about the cross and then some questions. It seems to me all the papers are sort of talking about what comes after displacement. Where do you go and with whom will you be when you go there? And I'm wondering for Jake and Aaron, where you all see the tie between fugitive arrivals and wayfaring and homemaking when the place is gone. So where are those things different? Where are they similar? I mean, of course, enslavement as an ultimate displacement, you know, and now for climate migrants. And then also, I think pushing still into this covenant conversation with Marcia, I almost want to go even deeper into the relational aspect of what a covenant is and say, like, I don't really need God to be immoral, but I do still want God to be irrational if God is a relational God, because relationships are, like, could God just be a mess or like messy? And that's kind of the beauty of a relational God. That is an example for us that relationships are messy and yet still worthwhile, and yet still how we get to wherever we're getting to after displacement or apocalypse. And then sort of to tie them together, like what would messy homemaking be? Because after the apocalypse, we don't have the scripts. I mean, I think that's one of the great things about the unveiling, is that to say, like, the scripts you've been living in have been chains. But then it's pretty messy process for how we go forward. So almost like covenant to me feels clean in a way that it is actually not if it's a relationship. So then how do we go forward through that? So those are but thank you all. I'll bring this back.
So if you want to read a comic graphic novel about God being a mess, I recommend Liana Fink's rewriting of Genesis, Let There Be Light, the real story of her creation. And God is a total mess in that. It's a comic graphic novel. It's kind of a young person's comic graphic novel. But there, if you want to go there, that's the place. That's one place to go. I think, last sentence, I think relationships are messy. I'm not sure that God needs to be a mess, but all relationships are messy.
Yeah, I mean, one question that I would have in response to that was also a question I had about Marcia's paper, and I think I've asked her this question before, but the way that covenant is characterized is emphasizing its formal features. You know, the relationship is primary, the integrity of the parties is respected, but that's pretty formal. Like, what's the relationship for? I mean, you know, what's the sort of point of it besides simply relationship and to maintain the relationship? It would appear like come what may. You don't want to say that, Marcia, do you?
I'm going to...
That the relationship is for the sake of the relationship and the maintaining of it.
In my understanding of covenants as opposed to contracts, contracts have purposes. You can say the purpose of this contract is that you build me a bookcase. The purpose is there's a bookcase at the end, right? But covenants precisely are not about the material outcome, right? They are about the motive and the purpose of the covenant is the relationship rather than its product. But maybe I haven't understood.
Yeah, no. But I mean, the relationships of different forms. Some are harmful relationships. Some are mutually beneficial relationships. I mean, if you just say it's, you know, for the relationship per se, that you.
So, yes, you have heard me drone on about covenant for, you know, everywhere I possibly can. Just, you know, give me an excuse.
I always want to hear more.
That's so, but, you know, in my understanding, what kind of relationship. It is for the flourishing of all engaged. It's for the flourishing of all the parties involved. And people like Jean Lee, who I very briefly quoted, but if you give me a chance, I'll, go on for days, emphasize this, it is a reciprocal bond for the flourishing of all in the reciprocity.
Yeah, okay, so flourishing. And
One last from a student, just for quick.
My apologies, and thank you for the time to ask a question. My name is Lerato Bito. I am a second-year PhD student in this beautiful university in the forest. And thank you for the papers. Dr. Erickson, I listened to you and I started thinking about the wildebeests situation in Kenya and Tanzania. Okay, and I started thinking to myself, I have a question, and I wrote it nicely. So looking at your framework, which for me it's inviting us to ask whether justice can remain anthropocentric. If climate change, displacements, debates, scholarship focus only on human refugees while ignoring animals' migrations disrupted by development, are we okay, yes, Lerato, breathe. You've got Catherine and Masha listening to you. Breathe. Are we reproducing a narrow moral map of who counts as inhabitants of the earth? Because for me, that is one of the biggest stories that it's not even talked about in the US, but it is a big deal in Africa.
Yeah, I'll segue, because I'll answer. I'll do a little bit of both. Maybe is absolutely the anthropocentric focus is deeply problematic in a lot of ways, but it also hides and occludes the ways that refugees are animalized, or where the logic of animality is used and weaponized to sort of dehumanize and also de-animalize animals, right? That it's not paying attention to anything in that context. And so paying attention to those intersections and thinking about the wildebeest migration, or I'm having like visions of the Masai Mara in my mind in other ways, is really important. And it's important partially for Karen's question as well, because displacements are always happening, right? We live on a planet where the earth beneath our feet is engaged in continental drift, point to O'Neill Van Horn's work, where the magnetic poles are wandering and moving, and if you study anything about not just animality and the migrations that animals take, but the geophysics of the planet, there's always displacing realities happening. But one of the things that's really important to note in nature writing is the way that focusing solely on this sort of idealized animal in its bioregion, as if it's sort of like pristine and has always existed that way, or has moved. There's a great paper on extinction yesterday as well, might not take into account the living movements of animality and the ways that displacement affects it. So I think it's important to take all of the above into account, and then recognize that human securitization processes and unnatural borders are affecting not just human beings, but also the ways that animals move and migrate, attention to coastal borders and planetary and island borders as well. And so paying attention to all of those in the way that Karen is saying as well is really important. That answers partially.
Yeah, and I will just say, Karen, to your question, what comes after, or maybe now along with, I'm thinking about I'm coming from positions of transformative and restorative justice, right, where people are thinking about what does it mean to be in relations of care, so what kinds of relationships that take accountability, that are always like kind of analyzing, and the narratives that I shared today, I think they really show care and accompaniment as a mode of being in what comes after. And so I think that speaks back to things like securitization, which connects to questions of criminalization, criminalization, you know, like that pushing back against those kinds of, again, retributive legal modes of being is really to and again, to come back to the relationship, I guess, is to like, what kinds of relationships are we imagining? And then also, you mentioned emplacement, right? I think about the work of Forrest Klingerman, really thinks a lot about emplacement. What does it mean to really take account of our emplacement in the world, and how do our relationships figure into that, I guess. So that's maybe.
Thank you. Would you join me in thanking this entire panel? While you're in such a grateful mood, will you also join me in thanking in particular Do-Hee Wu and Celia Kamara, who have been our audio and technical engineers. Those of us, it's a global campus. We are hitting people in time zones from the Pacific Rim to Eastern Africa. So because of that, we've been pretty good about trying to start and stop on time. Some people are joining us at 4 a.m., some are staying up till 11, so we want to honor their commitment with our which is my way of reminding us that we will reconvene at 1:30 fairly prompt. A couple of quick bookkeeping notes for the TTC panelists and others. We will gather again in Mead. For everyone else, it's an open campus, semi-open campus, which means walk around and enjoy yourself. If you can open the door, it's okay to go in. If you can't open the door, probably don't keep standing there trying. Someone will come along and wonder why. I would recommend, if you just want to stroll around a little bit, the western side of the campus over here is the more residential side, which is still more the classic forest. There's a reforestation project that goes on behind SW Bound that is just now starting to kind of wake up. There's a couple of ephemeral jewels on the ground that way. The Madison, yeah, right over there. Also over that way is the bookstore and the Commons, which is above it. You're invited to enjoy either one of those as you would wish, or you may go down. It's actually about a 15-minute walk. If you go out the main gate, turn right, go under the train track to lovely downtown Madison, which has bookstores and restaurants and other things like that. I believe the library is also open right now, right, Jesse says, till 5, so you can stroll around and catch up on the news. Would I ask for students who are current students here who would not mind having someone ask you for recommendations or directions? Would you raise your hand? Anybody? So 1, 2, 3, 4, look around and find somebody if you need a question or something served there. Finally, as you're enjoying the campus, you might want to explore the Arboretum. I like to go for a walk there after lunch. I'm going to be leaving with whoever else would like to go. Probably about 10 to 1, we can meet back here at the back porch of Mead and stroll over there together. The entrance to the Arboretum's a little bit tricky to find if you don't quite know how to get in there. It is a prepared trail with mulched, so you don't need special shoes, but if you got heels, you're going to be mad at me before we get back. Otherwise, I will see you all again at 1:30. Thank you.